Hello. I'd like to thank you all for joining me for this panel, and I'd like to thank the organizers of the AIMS conference for putting this together and giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. The title of my paper is Medusa Black, The Politics of Afro-Caribbean Identity in Dorothea Smartt's Medusa Poems. As a Black child of Barbadian immigrants, much of Dorothea Smartt's poetry explores the struggle to feel at home in a predominantly white Britain. In her book Connecting Medium, Smartt published a series of Medusa poems that utilize canonical counter-discourse to contest racial, imperial, and gendered power structures historically rooted in the authority of Greco-Roman classics. Parenthetically, it's worth mentioning that Smartt's Medusa was originally presented as a performance piece, but I'm looking at the published versions in Connecting Medium, in part because the larger project that this presentation comes out of is about Caribbean female poetry. Helen Tiffin, who coined the term canonical counter-discourse, explains that counter-discursive strategies involve a mapping of the dominant discourse, a reading and exposing of its underlying assumptions, and the dismantling of these assumptions from the cross-cultural standpoint of the imperially subjectified local. By using the Medusa figure as a basis for her critiques, Smartt challenges the hierarchical power structures of patriarchy and racism or imperialism, while simultaneously legitimizing her critiques by grounding them in the cultural capital of antiquity. In this presentation, I focus on Smartt's poems Medusa, Medusa Black, Let Her Monsters Write, Let Me Land, and Medusa Cuts Both Ways, which in my reading offer the richest examples of canonical counter-discourse from the 8 Medusa poems in Connecting Medium. These poems align Medusa's identity with the speaker's struggles as a Black Caribbean woman in Britain, particularly the internalized racism reflected by painful and destructive hair and skin treatments to meet white beauty standards, and the xenophobia of a society that often outright rejects immigrants or tries to force them to conform to the dominant culture. However, Smartt's poems also posit an alternative to these oppressive power structures by reclaiming the Medusa myth for African and diasporic women, especially in the poem Medusa Cuts Both Ways, which identifies Medusa with African and diasporic women. Smartt's poems reflect a complex liberatory reception grounded in writing back to hierarchical power structures and claiming possession of classical antiquity to authorize that challenge. Central to Smartt's Medusa poems are several specific themes, including the identification of African or African diasporic women's hair with Medusa's snakes, silencing, and feelings of social rejection. These themes are interconnected with and inspired by Smartt's own experiences as a child of Bajan immigrants in London. Her poetry often deals with the difficulties of feeling at home as a member of the African and Caribbean diasporas. This is a central theme in poems like Connecting Medium 2 and Gambian Sting, to take just 2 non-Medusa-focused examples from Connecting Medium. The first poem exemplifies the anxiety about not belonging in Britain, with the speaker recounting a childhood African ritual of placing pennies in the mouth of a glass West African fish statue to try and cure her homesickness, though it isn't clear which home the speaker is sick for, Barbados, Africa, or a Britain where she'll feel accepted. Gambian Sting complicates questions of longing for home even more, as it recounts a trip to Africa in which a protagonist seeking a connection to her ancestral homeland is conned by a group of young Gambians. Smartt's Medusa poems align with these thematic concerns about alienation. Smartt especially uses hair imagery throughout her Medusa poems. Sometimes these are merely passing references, but Medusa Black makes explicit how central hair is in the identification between the speaker and Medusa. The poem opens with a direct claim about Medusa's heritage. Medusa was a Black woman, African dread. Further on, the poem directly critiques the imposition of white beauty standards on African or African diasporic women, often involving painful hair and skin treatments to try and conform to Eurocentric standards of attractiveness. And this is a fairly long quote. Scrub it, bleach it, operate on it, powder it, straighten it, fry it, dye it, perm it, turn it back on itself. Make it go away, make it go away. Scrub it, step smiling into baths of acid and bleach it red raw, peel skin of life-sustaining melanin, operate on it, black skin, lying useless, discard it, powder it. Head, fuck it, wild-haired woman, straighten it, fry it, desperately burn scalps. Banish the snake woman, the wild woman, the all-seeing eye woman. Dye it, remembrances of Africa fast fading in the blonde highlights, turn us back on ourselves. So this lengthy excerpt of the poem highlights the painful experiences of trying to meet Eurocentric beauty standards. The almost 25 lines in a 57-line poem, and these are not the only lines about hair and skin treatments, give it significant weight as a thematic concern. The seriousness of this problem is further illustrated by the graphic nature of some of the imagery, especially that of burning, peeling skin, bleaching, and operations. Smart's language presents a horrifying picture of the attempts to destroy remembrances of Africa by destroying Black women's natural hair and skin. As Elizabeth Goodman argues, Smartt shows how expectations about Black women's appearance are connected to a sense of self-definition in relation to the cultural values of white women's appearance, and they're often found wanting. The speaker of the poem makes this explicit, writing, "My hair as it comes is just not good enough." This theme of not being able to find a place in British society without undergoing painful identity changes pervades the Medusa poems. The link between the Gorgon and anxiety about immigration specifically is perhaps most overt in Let Me Land, a poem about crossing the sea to a land where the characters are unwelcome. The opening portion of the poem is full of oceanic imagery through which patterns snake, rippling through the diaspora, before readers are enjoined to imagine arriving at a cold, damp shore that sounds stereotypically English. The poem ends by identifying Medusa as an immigrant to these clammy shores, arriving despite the apparent hostility of those already there whose eyes flame lava patterns on skins. Although Medusa and herself, an unidentified character, arrive in the UK, they are denied a voice. No words yet, just sounds. Wind, sea spray, distant thunder announce them. And these same concerns are expressed in Let Her Monsters Write. The poem opens with Medusa trying to squeeze herself into boxes where she doesn't fit, physicalizing the metaphor of trying to conform to unfamiliar social patterns. She struggles to reduce the scope of her frilly, outstretched body to the boxes that seek to constrict her. But the solution to this unnatural compression is artistic expression. Medusa seeks a voice. The poet persona implores, "Under hair, let her monsters write, from all sides, ceiling, walls, floor," as the only way to free Medusa's sing-song body lacy in the night. Medusa's inability to speak reflects her alienation, her sense of dislocation, and it's through artistic production that she begins creating space for herself. The use of Bajan Creole is evident throughout these poems. This language developed amongst the common people, often the enslaved or the downtrodden in the Caribbean. Historically, Caribbean Englishes were or are languages of resistance, challenging the primacy of Standard English by constructing new West Indian folk cultures, drawing on African, Spanish, French, Dutch, and indigenous vocabularies in addition to an English base. Cashman Kerr Prince calls this hybrid creation of new languages post-colonial philology, which he describes as breaking the customary order of language, reversing the accepted significations, marks a Creole writer's liberation from the hegemony of one language or culture, from the tyranny of a masterful imperial culture. In other words, by rejecting Standard English with its colonialist history and instead embracing a hybridized new language, post-colonial authors undercut the cultural authority of colonialism itself. Smartt frequently deploys Bajan Creole rather than Standard English, although in many of her poems she does write in Standard English, aligning the speakers of her poems with Afro-Barbadian folk culture. Medusa cuts both ways, for instance, begins with the lines, "Dread, an African woman, full of sheself with dim duty eye looks." And it is worth noting the hair connection here is significant, in part because dreads in Rasta religion, which is Jamaican more than Bajan, but has influence throughout the Caribbean, The term dread can refer either to dreadlocks, the hairstyle, or to people who wear the hairstyle. So again, we have these very subtle elements in some cases connecting hair to identity. But this opening, dread, an African woman full of sheself with dim dirty eye looks. This opening overtly aligns the use of Creole language with African heritage by identifying the subject of the poem as an African woman. In addition to resisting a standard English imposed by British colonialism, these poems associate the cultural capital of the classics with Bajan Creole. By discussing Greco-Roman mythology in a Caribbean language, these poems assert a cultural connection to the ancient myth, assert that Caribbean culture is linked to antiquity in the same ways that colonialist ideology would seek to reserve for European culture. This identification between the cultural capital of classics and Caribbean or Black diasporic culture is made most overt in Smart's poem Medusa Cuts Both Ways, which explicitly identifies with Medusa with a number of Black women, including Assata Shakur, Audre Lorde, and Queen Nzinga Mbande. The speaker then goes on to identify Medusa with a female African ancestral lineage and as a source of protection. Medusa is our mother's mothers, myself all coiled into one. Medusa is spirit. Medusa is you in me in you. Medusa is my shield, impregnable, my aegis. No mythical Aegean people shield, this is my armor. With Shango double-headed axe, Yamoja Okuta, my battle dress armor of serious dread. These lines claim Medusa for African women, aligning her not only with the individual African and diasporic women as the poem had previously done, but symbolically identifying her as a collective ancestor. Smartt also seems to adopt the position of Athena, or the poet persona almost seems to adopt the position of Athena, claiming Medusa as the aegis, or divine shield of protection. But she rejects the myth's Greek origin, renouncing mythical Aegean people, in favor of locating Medusa within an African pantheon, including the Yoruba thunder god Shango and river goddess Yamoja. There's basis, at least in Roman accounts, of the Medusa myth for locating her in Africa, a tradition that Afro-Caribbean and other African diasporic writers who adopt the Medusa legend often, at least implicitly, capitalize on. The Roman writer Diodorus Siculus locates both the Amazons and the Gorgons in Africa, west of Egypt. Lucian provides more detail, writing that Medusa is said to have lived in the far west of Africa, at the point where the ocean laps against the hot earth in a wide, untilled, treeless region, which she had turned entirely to stone merely by gazing around her. He also claims that there are poisonous snakes in Libya because they sprang up whenever Medusa's blood hit the ground, as Perseus flew with her severed head over North Africa. Given these accounts, it's reasonable to read post-colonial reclamations of Medusa as participating in the Afro-classicist project, wherein classic scholars have documented the African and Middle Eastern or Asian roots of Greek culture. The most famous of Afro-classicists is probably Martin Bernal, whose book Black Athena challenged traditional narratives about the origin of Greek civilization. In the context of artistic adaptation, Kevin Wetmore characterizes the Black Athena model as a reappropriation of material that is already African in origin. And while a poem like Medusa Cuts Both Ways may seem to reappropriate a myth that Diodorus Siculus and Lucian linked to Africa, I would argue that Smart's poems align more closely with Wetmore's Black Dionysus scheme, a form of canonical counter-discourse. Wetmore explains the Black Dionysus model thus: the post-Afrocentric formulation, that is, counter-hegemonic, self-aware, refuses to enforce dominant notions of ethnicity and culture, and uses ancient Greek material to inscribe a new discourse that empowers and critiques all cultures, even as it identifies the colonizer's power and the colonized powerlessness. In other words, the Black Dionysus style refuses essentialism. Rather than attempting to reinscribe a new Afrocentric but still essentialist model of classical culture. Instead, Black Dionysus writers refuse the notion that Europe owns Greco-Roman antiquity, laying claim to the heritage not because it is originally African, but because it is part of a shared global heritage. We see this in both the content and the hybridity of these Creole language poems about classical mythology. Smartt stakes a claim to her non-exclusive ownership of the mythical canon, a claim enacted by her use of canonical counter-discourse. Thank you.